Welcome, and today we're going to deal with Lecture 19, and this is going to be talking about Americans' participation on the world stage, their participation in their activities with regard to other countries, namely, of course, Britain, France, and, of course, Native Americans. So this is Lecture 19. And as a new nation that is up and coming, and also a new nation that has thrown off the yoke of probably the most powerful nation in the world of that time, Great Britain, the ability of the Americans to negotiate themselves on this world stage is going to be absolutely crucial for their development. So let's see how they work this out. Today we're going to analyze the changes in U.S. goals with regard to foreign policy and expansion in the early 19th century, and this is going to correspond with key concept 4.3. So, now, things weren't going all that well with regard to foreign policy, namely with regard to Britain and France. There was an awful lot of pressure having developed from the Federalist leadership before the turn of the 19th century. So we had George Washington and John Adams maintaining a strict neutrality with regard to the conflict that has arisen between Britain and France. Of course, France was involved in the French Revolution. They ended up at war with Britain, and this war was largely fought on the seas. Of course, American ships are going to be involved in this, and both Britain and France are going to kind of prey on American ships and American shipping. But with regard to American feelings toward this war, this war between Britain and France, there was an awful lot of animosity toward both of these countries, even though France was our erstwhile ally. John Adams, to his credit, is going to be able to keep the United States out of war with France. It was just simply not a good idea. The United States was not prepared for war. Unfortunately, those who followed him were not going to be so scrupulous in that regard. And of course, at this time, we end up seeing that in 1800, instead of France being run by a revolutionary government, France was run increasingly by a dictator, Napoleon I. And Napoleon I is going to kind of have relatively decent interactions with the United States, namely with regard to the sale of the Louisiana Purchase. And during this time, the tendency and the benefit of the doubt is going to shift toward France, and greater and heightened aggression is going to be focused on Britain, and we'll find out why in just a moment. One of the contributing factors, of course, was the famous Chesapeake incident pictured here, in which a U.S. ship called the Chesapeake was stopped by a British warship. The British warship demanded to enter onto the American vessel and search that vessel. The captain of the Chesapeake refused, and the warship ends up firing on the Chesapeake and killing a number of soldiers. And this is going to outrage the American public and shift public opinion against Britain. Of course, there's going to be clamoring for wars, and in our Congress, there's always somebody clamoring for a war. Typically those who will benefit and profit from these wars. But for the most part, again, Thomas Jefferson is going to be able to steer the country through this time period without going to war. And James Madison, James Madison's going to fall a little short. But one of the inflaming problems that the United States is going to have still is going to be these Native Americans. These Native Americans, of course, the United States had just purchased the Louisiana Territory. Americans were moving into these western territories. They were coming into the contact and conflict with Indian tribes that they had never really been in contact with before. Also spreading disease among many of these tribes that had been relatively insulated from European diseases. And this is going to leave a bad taste in the mouth of many of the native folks there. This is again going to be exacerbated by the victory of General Mad Anthony Wayne over a confederacy of Native Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. The Battle of Fallen Timbers is going to force Native Americans to sign the Treaty of Fort Wayne, and this is going to concede huge tracts of land to the Americans, and this is going to be a real sore spot for Native Americans in the West. And Native Americans at this point in the West are going to find themselves in a situation where they either have to find a way to accommodate the changing cultures in this new world that they're living in, or they're going to try to resist. And some of the native cultures do try to accommodate and acculturate. Groups of the Cherokee and the Chickasaws, for instance, will try to accommodate. Not all of them. Some of them will split off. That was the nature of Native American culture at that time. But there were those who did attempt to resist, namely a movement that was started by a fellow by the name of Tenskwatawa. He was known as the Prophet, and he is going to preach kind of an Indian purity message, that we have to get away from these white people. We kind of see this. We've seen this before, right? Let's get away from these white folks. Let's get back to our traditional ways of doing things, and then everything will be fine. He wasn't necessarily suggesting that any spiritual thing's going to come down and protect them, but the idea is in order to reestablish our power, we have to go back to the traditional ways that we had. Of course, this is not a particularly realistic perspective. The traditional ways worked for a traditional time, but this was not a traditional time period for Native Americans. This was a time period of rapid social change. Either way, these resistance movements are going to develop. Tenskwatawa's brother, a fellow by the name of Tecumseh, pictured here, was a great military leader, and he decides to add to the word of the prophet by suggesting military resistance to white advancement, and that's exactly what he's going to do. He will put together what becomes known as the Pan-Indian Military Resistance Movement, led by Tecumseh, and focused on kind of driving the white people away from these lands and securing their lands for themselves. Tecumseh is going to have a number of military victories. However, he will encounter a bit of a defeat when he was facing this gentleman, a fellow by the name of General William Henry Harrison, who will kind of sort of defeat Tecumseh at the battle of what's called the Battle of Tippecanoe. Now, the battle itself was largely a draw. Both sides lost about the same number, but Tecumseh, in order to protect the rest of his army, is going to leave the field, and that's going to give General Harrison the chance to declare victory. And from this moment on, of course, William Henry Harrison will be known as Old Tippecanoe, which is one of my favorite nicknames in history. And it's also going to spur Tecumseh to enter into a military alliance with the British. And the British are going to back Tecumseh in his battles against the Americans, mostly with guns, British-made guns. So, of course, as Americans are fighting with Tecumseh and Tecumseh's forces, and they pick up these British-made guns on the battlefield, they're like, what the heck? These are British-made guns. You can't be arming the Indians. So, again, this is another strike against the British during this time, which is going to ultimately lead to a clamor for war among some of our legislators. Now, James Madison wasn't a big proponent of this idea of war. He believed, kind of like Jefferson, let's stay out of war. Although Jefferson did send a Marine outfit in the Battle of Tripoli to deal with a group of pirates that were troubling American merchants. So Jefferson was not afraid of military conflict, but didn't want to get into a military conflict with Britain or with France. Madison was of the similar mindset, but Madison was no match for a group of people in Congress that became known as the War Hawks. Namely, the War Hawks were from Madison's own party, right? The Democratic Republicans. They were folks like Henry Clay, representing the West, the western regions of the country, and John C. Calhoun, representing the southern interests of the country. And of course, these regions had very definite reasons as to why they would want to go to war with Britain. People in the West were very upset with the fact that the British were supporting Native Americans who were killing Americans, storming their villages, killing settlers. attacking settlers with British-made weapons. This was a sore spot, an understandable sore spot for people in the West, whom Henry Clay and others represented. The folks in the South were also very concerned because their slaves were running away and running to Spanish Florida, where they were mingling with the Seminole tribes in Florida and finding freedom. So this became a sore spot for Southerners. So regionally, the folks of the West and the folks of the South were in favor of this war. And these folks were largely representative of the Democratic Republican Party. The Federalists, on the other hand, were not particularly in favor of going to war with Britain. They tended to be pro-British. They represented northeastern merchants, and these northeastern merchants oftentimes were doing business with the British and did not want that business to be sullied by warfare. But the reasons for going to war is going to be British support for Native Americans, violations of neutral shipping. The United States had declared neutrality, but the British kept boarding American ships and pressing American soldiers, claiming that these American sailors were deserters. And of course, good old-fashioned territorial expansion. What better way to keep your slaves from running to Florida than to, take Florida? What's a better way to expand than to get Canada? Of course, we love that sweet little jewel of Canada sitting to the north of us. And Canada was also a source of insecurity. It was a British possession to the north that could, at any given time, attack the United States. So territorial expansion is also somewhat combined with a sense of security. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of the war, what became known as the War of 1812. Understand that this was also, in Europe, part of the Napoleonic Wars. France, again, was a bit of an ally during this time. We were fighting the British, who were a French enemy. Unfortunately, the French, at this stage of the game, are not going to be much of a help to us. It was 1812 when Napoleon meets his worst defeat, or one of his worst defeats, in a campaign against the Russians, in which his entire army was pretty much wiped out. So, but this is an extension of these considered an extension of these Napoleonic Wars. The United States is going to experience some very important victories. I'm going to highlight just a couple here. Of course, the first of which was the Battle of Put-in Bay, in which Oliver, the famous naval captain Oliver Hazard Perry, will defeat a British force on Lake Erie and establish American dominance over Lake Erie. The Battle of the Thames, fought again by General William Henry Harrison, Old Tippecanoe, in which he defeats Tecumseh's army, and in fact, ultimately, Tecumseh will die during that battle. This is called the Battle of the Thames. The Battle of Horseshoe Bend will introduce a brand new character into the play, the saga of American history. Andrew Jackson, and Andrew Jackson will offer his first real good famous defeat, the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, which was one of the worst military defeats for Native Americans, probably the worst military defeat for Native Americans up to that time. And it is going to, by the way, Jackson is actually going to have Native Americans helping him during this battle. Jackson was not only leading American soldiers, but he was actually leading Cherokees, Chickasaws, and Choctaws into battle against the Creeks and the Red Sticks. It didn't do the Cherokee and the Chickasaws and the Choctaws any good. We will talk about Andrew Jackson's Indian policies later on. So these are some major ones. Also, too, we can't forget the famous Battle of New Orleans. Bam! Andrew Jackson, yet again, in which Andrew Jackson defeats a British force at New Orleans and secures American possession of that city, and consequently secures American access to the Mississippi River. Ironically, however, the Battle of New Orleans was fought shortly after the War of 1812 ended with the signing of the Treaty of Ghent. Of course, Jackson didn't intend this. He had no idea that the war was in fact over. Word had not gotten to him. So the battle still counts, and it counts as a major American victory, and a very, very important American victory at that. Now, during the war, there was dissent. Oh, by the way, some American failures. I mean, we can't fail. A big goal here was the conquest of Canada, to take over those lands in Canada, and the United States is going to fail miserably at doing that. And after this point, never again is the United States going to attack Canada. Canada successfully defends itself from American incursions. And also, probably most crucially, the British are going to blockade the United States, and they will invade. And of course, one of the first places that they're going to invade is Washington, D.C. They will invade Washington, D.C. They will take the city and they will burn it to the ground. A huge setback for the United States. Dolly Madison, by the way, James Madison's wife, very, very popular, will actually, while the White House is burning, while the Capitol is burning, she grabs a famous portrait of George Washington and rescues it from the flames, and of course becomes very, very popular for that, among other things. Now, this was not a popular war. There was a lot of dissension here. The Federalists were not supporters of the war. That was one of the reasons why things didn't go so well in Canada. The northeastern states were really not all that happy about supplying an invasion base for U.S. Army, U.S. military going into Canada. So the Federalists had some real problems with this, and there was some dissension even among the Democratic Republicans. But the Federalists are going to get together at the Hartford Convention, and they're going to decide that this war is unconstitutional, and that, in fact, many of them decided maybe we should just secede from the Union and start our own country. Of course, this was shunned, but ultimately the Hartford Convention is going to come up with a policy known as nullification. And nullification is the idea that the states should have the power to nullify laws that are unconstitutional. This wasn't a new idea. Of course, we've already talked about this. Jefferson and Madison had come up with similar ideas with the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. Now, Hartford, Connecticut, and the Northeast is suggesting, hey, maybe we should be able to nullify laws that we don't agree with based on their constitutionality. But ultimately, the Hartford Convention is going to be short-lived. The United States will ultimately sign a peace treaty with Britain. The Napoleonic Wars are going to end in 1815 with the defeat of Napoleon, and once the Napoleonic Wars were over, Britain decided to get out of the war business completely and end its war with the United States. For the most part, the War of 1812 is going to end in a draw. But when you consider the fact that the United States was a much weaker power than Britain, a not loss is kind of a win for the United States. The Treaty of Ghent will simply, reassert U.S. independence. The British and the Americans will simply decide to stop fighting. British will again say we'll take our forces out of the western forts and that kind of thing. It wasn't much of a treaty, but consequently, as a result of the War of 1812. The United States kind of reinforces its sense of nationalism, its sense of national identity. It starts to see itself as a cohesive nation, which kind of puts a kibosh on this whole Hartford Convention idea of secession. Also, the United States kind of sees itself as, hey, we just beat the British again. We're pretty badass. So, there are some consequences of this particular war, some more psychological and symbolic consequences than real consequences. There wasn't really any land exchanged or anything along those lines. Of course, we get a sense of this with a couple of primary sources that I wanted to kind of show you here. The first one comes from Abigail Adams, in which she says, "We have our firesides, our comfortable habitations, our cities, our churches, and our country to defend. Our rights, privileges, and independence to preserve, and for these are we not justly contending?" So she's kind of saying, well, maybe we have a reason to go to war here. But now here's the rub. Thus it appears to me, yet I hear from our pulpits, our churches, and read from our presses that it is an unjust, a wicked, a ruinous, and unnecessary war. There's dissent. This is not a popular war. In fact, some historians are suggesting that there was more dissent in the War of 1812 than there was even in Vietnam, which was, of course, famous for its dissent toward the later years. Now, listen to this is what fascinates me. Look at this. let me get my magic pen here ready. Look at this, look at this. A house divided upon itself. And upon that found a house divided. Whenever I heard that before, holy cow! Abraham Lincoln is going to use this very same line. A house divided upon itself, and upon that foundation do our enemies build their hopes of subduing us. So Abigail Adams here is afraid. Of course, Abigail Adams comes from a Federalist family in the Northeast. Of course, she's going to be against this war, but she's also kind of saying, you know what, the dissension is probably a bad thing. It's probably something that our enemies are waiting for us to fall upon. She didn't have much to worry about. The United States' performance in the War of 1812, although not necessarily definitive, did earn some pretty dogged admiration on the part of quote-unquote our enemies. This is a letter from Lieutenant Michael Scott. Of course, I want to look at these. I want to start with the sources here. Lieutenant Michael Scott, British Navy. Okay, well, he was probably actually involved in this war. So, and he tells me right out, hey, I don't like Americans. I never did, never shall like them. I have no wish to eat with them, drink with them, deal with, or consort with them in any way. But let me tell the whole truth, nor fight with them. Were it not for the laurels to be acquired by overcoming an enemy so brave, determined, and alert, and in every way so worthy of one's steel, as they have always proved. There's a certain amount of, admiration going on here that may have been born from this War of 1812. The War of 1812, of course, isn't the end of American performance on the world stage. It wasn't even the greatest performance. Much of our biggest successes during this time is going to happen after the War of 1812, when President James Monroe, we remember James Monroe, who helped to negotiate the Louisiana Purchase, he will become president in 1820, and probably he's going to be very famous for his foreign policy victories. And a big reason for why he was famous for these foreign policy victories is because of the person he chose as Secretary of State. Of course, the Secretary of State is responsible for negotiating our relationship with foreign countries. And in this case, it was none other than John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a brilliant diplomat. He was the son of Abigail and John Adams, of course, from the Adams family in Massachusetts. He comes from that kind of Federalist tradition. James Monroe, a Democratic Republican, was famous for bringing Federalists into his party. Under the leadership of John Quincy Adams, the United States is going to negotiate some very interesting treaties. For instance, the Rush-Bagot Treaty of 1817, which is going to be very important. It's actually going to limit the number of warships on both sides in the Great Lakes. This was right after the War of 1812, and now both sides are saying, hey, let's kind of back down with our arms race here a little bit and kind of limit the number of ships that we're going to have on the Great Lakes. This was a very, very important treaty for relations with the United States and Britain. If there were more warships on the Great Lakes, that would create more pressure and more animosity between these two countries. Also, very famously, the Transcontinental Treaty, or otherwise known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, or the Florida, the Florida Acquisition Treaty of 1819, in which the Spanish, after being pressured from numerous incursions of a general by the name of, guess what, Andrew Jackson, actually moving into Florida and attacking Spanish possessions in Florida under the guise of hunting down rogue Indians and recapturing slaves. The Spanish are going to say, you know what, we're done with this. The Spanish weren't in all that great a shape anyway. They were losing a lot of territories. We had a lot of revolutions going on in Spanish territory during this time. So they're going to try to be done with it. They're going to sign the Adams-Onis Treaty, in which they're going to cede Florida to the United States as an American territory. They will also cede the territory of Oregon to the United States, which the Americans had started to already make inroads into the Oregon territory. Anyway, which of course brings the United States all the way to the Pacific Ocean, potentially. Now we have the beginning of a dream, right? The idea of spreading from sea to shining sea. Also, under John Quincy Adams is the Russo-American Treaty of 1824, in which the Russians who were spreading down into Alaska and into Western Canada are going to say, all right, well, this will be our southern boundary. We're not going to spread any further than that, which is going to, kind of improve relations with Russia and take some of the pressure off of Britain and the United States settling in the Oregon Territory. But most crucially for Adams, and this was probably one of Adams' most impressive tasks, is he became a key author of a policy that is going to bear the name of the president that used this policy, the Monroe Doctrine. See, there were all kinds of uprisings going on in Spanish territory, and many areas in Spanish territory were declaring their independence from Spain. Of course, the most famous of which is the Bolivarian revolutions taking place in South America. And the United States was very, very worried about this. If these areas break away from Spain, also in Mexico and that kind. So if these regions break away from Spain, then what's to stop other European powers from coming in and establishing other colonies and establishing a foothold in the Western Hemisphere? This is a threat to the United States. So John Quincy Adams and James Monroe issued the Monroe Doctrine, in which they say, look, the Western Hemisphere is in the domain of the United States. It is a United States interest, and the United States is not going to tolerate any more colonization taking place in this hemisphere. If you already have colonies, good for you. You can keep them. But no more new colonies, and you're not going to interfere with independent countries that are gaining ground during this time. So Europeans, stay out of the Western Hemisphere. This is an American sphere of influence. We'll be using that term quite often. Now this is great stuff, but what would be the European response? And for the most part, the European response was kind of a bit of anger and suggesting, well, this country, the United States, is going to tell us where we can and where we cannot make our colonies. But the bottom line is ultimately the British kind of supported the Monroe Doctrine. They also did not want to see other European powers coming into the Americas and setting up their own lands in this hemisphere. So the Monroe Doctrine fortunately had the backing of the British Empire, and a lot of countries decided they weren't going to fight the British over this. But also, quite frankly, during this time period, the Europeans were tired of 15 years of warfare during the Napoleonic Wars. They had their own countries to build and put back together, and that was difficult enough as it was. You had revolutions going on in France still, these revolutionary tendencies, and the reassertion of the old regime in Europe as well. It was a pretty tenuous grip that they had, and they weren't really into the whole let's expand ourselves out militarily into the Western Hemisphere. It just wasn't worth the effort at this stage of the game. So the Monroe Doctrine will become a huge diplomatic success, despite the fact that the United States really didn't have the power to enforce this doctrine. Consequently, the Monroe Doctrine remains in effect, even to this day. Now, this was not a law. This was not passed by Congress. This was simply the president saying, this is going to be my policy as Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of the United States. This was not something passed by Congress. So, holy cow. And yet it kind of set the tradition of when a president creates a policy, creates a doctrine, that it will carry forward as it has. And the only thing that has happened to the Monroe Doctrine since then has been presidents adding to the doctrine. No president has ever gotten up and said, you know what, the Monroe Doctrine really doesn't make any sense, we should just not do it anymore. No, instead, presidents such as Teddy Roosevelt are actually going to make the doctrine even stronger and expand the doctrine to cover more areas. So, but anyway, what we see here is the very first forays of the United States into the world scene in the early 19th century. And they have been largely successful up to now. So that's it for now, and we will see you later.